Mayors, how you doing out there today? Welcome to the webinar, the Lead Homelessness webinar, Finding Solutions to Panhandling. We're excited that you can join us. I know a lot of folks are joining right now on the East Coast and on the West Coast. Let me introduce myself. I'm Andre Bailey. I am the CEO and founder of an organization called Lead Homelessness, and we work with mayors, business chambers, continuums of care, people around America who are trying to find solutions to homelessness. So I'm happy that you could join. If you work for a mayor, if you're with a mayor right now conferencing, we've talked to a lot of folks out there who are your teams are all on this webinar together. That's fantastic. And there's also law enforcement on this webinar. We're excited to have you on a part of this conversation, on the webinar and part of the conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. First, though, if you have a question about panhandling, homelessness, anything we're talking about, I warn you, mayors, we're going to cover a lot of ground in an hour. This is not meant to give you all the answers in 1 hour because it's too much. But I want to cover a lot of ground because I think there's a framework. If you want to solve panhandling and you really, you're getting complaints in your downtown area, your law enforcement is exacerbated and struggling, there's a lot you got to talk about to frame this issue properly. And so we want to frame it today. And for many of you who are already talking to us, working with us, we'll find time to do calls afterward, or for many of you, we're helping you put together some of the work beyond this. But if you have a question, please submit it in the GoToMeeting webinar registration link or the email, and we will get to your question. So here's what we're going to cover today. We've got 1 hour. Get out your pens, pads of paper, and your pens and your pencils. Take notes, ask us questions. But we want to talk about panhandling in a broad sense. We're going to tell you about a new panhandling study that's not even released yet. It'll be released publicly in November. You're going to get a sneak preview of this panhandling study, really one of the first of its kind in America, where our organization partnered together with some researchers and studied panhandling in a downtown corridor in a way that had never been done before. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about public space management in regards to your homeless population, folks living on the streets. Best practices with law enforcement. We're going to get into the legalities of what you can and cannot do with law enforcement, and some kind of current trends we're seeing that are a little bit concerning, and that we're going to give you specific advice there. And we want to get into the specifics of not just panhandling, but also encampments and the ordinances in regards to aggressive panhandling, sit and lie, all these very complicated things that your community is struggling with. We want to talk about those over the next hour. So again, ask questions. If you have a question, put it in the GoToMeeting box right there. We're going to try to answer as many questions as possible, or you can email your questions. Let me start by saying, I have the opportunity, Lead Homelessness, I have the opportunity to talk to mayors around America. I was one of the speakers at the U.S. Conference of Mayors 2 years ago. I work with business chambers, mayors, law enforcement around America all the time. Every community in America is struggling with homelessness, panhandling right now. And, I'll tell you, the first thought I want to give to you guys as you're watching this is I think homelessness, panhandling, all these issues are really at a crossroads right now, because although many cities have seen kind of incremental progress on homelessness, and there's been a lot of movements, a lot of initiatives you've seen, national initiatives to end homelessness, well-meaning initiatives with a lot of good ideas. I think most people would agree that cities and communities are struggling. And a lot of these big ideas we had to solve homelessness in our cities, they haven't worked exactly the way we wanted them to. And it doesn't take much to now turn the news on, and you turn the news on and you see cities across America. I'm not picking on these cities. Some of these cities are on the webinar right now. Not picking on you. I would just say we picked these 5 cities out. A lot of communities seeing encampments, panhandling, homelessness, And by the way, Mayor, like you, probably investing a lot of money and still seeing big challenges. And so it really is concerning to me because I feel like our country right now, not just your city, Mayor, if there's something you can feel better about, it's that if you could talk to the other 100 or so mayors on this webinar, if you guys could all talk to each other, when you talk to each other at the Conference of Mayors and other places where mayors convene, you're all struggling with this. And as a nation, I think we are really taking a look in the mirror and saying, where do we go from here? And so that's what this webinar is really about. Where do we go from here on panhandling, homelessness, encampments, and all of these issues together? And how do we, mayors, law enforcement, everybody out there, listen to this and hear me well. I am not here to tell you that arresting people and incarcerating people is the way forward. I'm not here to tell you that. But at the same time, for those of you that are knowledgeable on homelessness, you've done a lot of work in this space, I'm such a fan of Housing First and all of these coordinated ways that we're targeting to get people off the streets. I'm a fan of those. But I would tell you, we have to find a new way forward that combines both compassion for people who need to get off the streets and common sense. Mayor Eric Garcetti, who I've had a chance to meet a few times out of Los Angeles, what a challenge that the city of Los Angeles has. I would tell you, Mayor Garcetti said this the other day, and I think it's a great statement. He said the crisis of homelessness in our community and around America is really two crises. It's two tragedies. It's the tragedy of those who are on the streets and who can't find their way off the streets, and it's terrible to see these folks in your community on the streets panhandling and with no other options. But it's also the tragedy of the death of public spaces in our communities. I would tell you, I think that's how we, mayors, law enforcement, others, have to look at this. We have to start looking at how do we help people compassionately while at the same time preserving our public spaces. And that's what we're going to talk about really today. We have a poll question for you. There's a poll that should be right there on your screen. What is the biggest challenge you're facing in your city? Is it homelessness? Is it panhandling? Is it encampments? All of the above, other? This is a poll question. Go ahead and answer that right now. We're curious. We want to get data from you in this webinar as well. So let's dive right in. There's kind of 3 key points I want to talk to you about on this webinar today, and get your questions and answer your questions today. Key point number 1, to find solutions for panhandling, you have to understand who is on your streets. So mayors, you're getting a sneak preview right now of a study. I'm about to hit the clicker and you're going to start seeing a new study that has not been released yet, but I'm going to give you an early sneak preview of the findings that we have from a panhandling study we did. It took over a year where we partnered with a local university to study panhandling in a local community. And let me talk to you for a few minutes about those results. So in this study on panhandling, we took one community and I'm not going to tell you which community it is, but you probably can figure this out, and you'll be able to figure this out, once we release the full study. But we went just inside of the CRA of one big downtown community, and we wanted to look at panhandling. And so we individually studied how many people are homeless, how many homeless folks are panhandling, who are the chronic panhandlers, what sources, what are they looking for, why are they panhandling, what role does law enforcement play. So we studied this for over a year, and I want to just give you a snapshot, sneak preview of what we found. Because I think it's going to be very, very important, because you got to know who's on your streets if you have any hope of solving this issue. So we went and we looked at, in this particular downtown area, we took, again, a certain geography. And this geography is not that large. It's a CRA of a downtown area. And we observed those that we found were chronically panhandling. Now, if you go and look for that term in Google, You're not going to find it because it's a term we kind of created for the purposes of this report. What chronic panhandling is we had all these homeless individuals that we found inside of this geographic area. So in this geographic area, we found approximately 400 or 500 people at any given time were homeless, were reporting themselves as homeless inside of this geographic area. But what our researchers found, and again, we did this study over 12 months, is that when you looked at the majority of the panhandling that was happening, the majority of the panhandling was happening with only a small percentage of the people of the 400. What we found is this, that a small cohort, and don't really focus on these numbers, focus more on the principles here, Mayor, because you might have 100 people in your community homeless, you might have 10,000, but the principles here are the same. We found a cohort of 63 people in a community that had roughly 400 or 500 homeless that were doing most of the panhandling. And when I say most, upwards of 80-90%. So who were these people? Because I'm telling you, you got to know who's homeless on your streets if you're going to understand panhandling. It was fascinating, and you're going to hear more about this when we release this report to you. But I want to give you the headlines. The headlines are this: not too many veterans left on the streets of many of our cities around America. I encourage you to look into this, but I think that some of the programs we've done with veterans have done great work in reducing the amount of veterans on the street. But kind of skipping through some of this, the vast majority of the people that we found who were doing the chronic panhandling were not professional panhandlers. They were not folks who were, the old adage that the people who are panhandling in your community are folks who get dressed up as homeless people, get in their car, and are dropped off someplace, and they panhandle for a while, and they go home and pass the money out to some ringleader. Listen, I know some of you out there right now are like, oh, yep, that's who the panhandlers are in our community. I will tell you this, especially in densely populated areas and rural areas, it could be a little bit less of this. It's possible. But for some of you, especially in cities, I'm telling you, this is what you're going to find, and this is what our study found. That panhandling is really the 63 people, almost all of them, virtually all of them, fell into what is the intersection of kind of three areas. Number one, they were actually homeless. The vast majority of them were homeless, and there really was no person that had traditional housing and was a professional panhandler. That was interesting. Now, that's not to say, again, that there aren't people who panhandle who aren't professional panhandlers. We're saying the people that were out there every day, 6, 8, 10 hours a day, they were not faking their homelessness. They were actually homeless. And this will make more sense as I go through this. But the other two factors were that the folks in our cohort were both mentally ill, had mental illness, and they suffered from drug addiction. So as we talked to the individuals in our study, many of them talked about how they were the folks that were kind of on the streets over and over again. This is the one geographic area that we built this chart for. They were on our streets over and over again, kind of those cyclical, chronic homeless individuals. But what we found again is that when you talk to each of these individuals, they were homeless for many long periods of time, and that they were panhandling, the vast majority of them, to both feed a drug or alcohol addiction. But again, I want you to use caution right now with where you might go with that. We found that the drug addiction was most likely clinically tied to a mental illness, a co-occurring disorder, and these people were homeless. So again, I think it's very important for you to know who's homeless in your community and why, because now I'm going to tie that into panhandling again. When this community, and it'll have a chance to look at this in a broad sense soon, when it looks at solving panhandling, it has to say who's doing the panhandling and then what are ultimately the solutions. So I wanted to run that by you guys as mayors because I think it's incredibly important. Chronic homelessness, if this is not a term that your staff, mayor, some of you are sitting with your staff right now, law enforcement, if this is not something you're talking about, there's a handful of things. If I never see you again, if we never talk again, I will stress this to you. One of the reasons homelessness is so confusing in America is because we talk about homelessness from all these different vantage points. People who were veterans, people with disabilities, people who are in poverty. We have all this homelessness, situational homelessness, but we don't break it down into kind of a common sense categories. I'm telling you that when we have studied panhandling, both in this study that we're releasing and in other communities that we've worked, panhandling is really done, the vast majority, by people who are chronically homeless. And if they're chronically homeless, they're in this cycle where they are being arrested. A lot of the panhandlers in our study had been arrested over 100 times. These are people who are not professional panhandlers, but again, these are folks who using drugs because of a mental illness, and their homelessness is probably a result of that. Why is that important, Mayor? Why is that important? Because one huge factor is going to be you considering how you adopt things like housing first, but do it in a way that really might target those with severe mental illness, mental disabilities, because they're some of the folks doing a lot of the panhandling. So knowing who's on your streets, knowing the costs associated with those individuals, that's going to be an incredibly important part of your solution. We just wanted to dive into that really briefly, but I would tell you, if you have this is the point that I really want to make to you. If you have this idea that the people who are panhandling the most are professional panhandlers who are not homeless and who are not folks who are chronically homeless, you might believe a lot of different things in what that means, but that's not true. In your community, I promise you, if we were to do this study in your community, the vast majority of people who are panhandling the most are not probably professional panhandlers, but they're probably folks with both mental illness and addiction. Let me come back to that. There's a lot of people in our cohort, there's a lot of people that we studied that were homeless but weren't chronic panhandlers. There's many people who suffered from some level of mental illness, but that addiction wasn't there, so that's where they weren't panhandling at a rate that was worthy of getting attention. The poll question, we wanted shocking, not shocking, but the answer is all of the above. So you are out there struggling with panhandling, you're struggling with encampments, you're struggling with all aspects of this crisis, homelessness, and that's not surprising. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we're going to answer a few questions. Right, I'll answer one question right now. What tips would you? This is Idalia Luna, mayor's assistant in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. What tips would you provide that have been effective and compassionate communication towards the homeless population? So great question, Idalia. Let me just say this. If you take everything I just said on panhandling and you really take it to heart, what I'm saying here is that you're going to have to probably realize that you're not, again, this is going to go back to the idea that you're not going to be able to just arrest your way out of panhandling towards panhandling solutions, especially since a lot of these folks have disabilities, they are mentally challenged, mentally ill. And so the compassionate piece to this from a communication standpoint is that these folks are not professional panhandlers. In your community, you probably have some professional panhandlers. I would tell you, though, it's probably not the folks making up the vast majority. So helping people understand that law enforcement has to be involved, in many times with these individuals, but everyone has compassion when someone's on the streets, especially because of a disabling condition. So Adalia, focusing people on that fact, I think, can be incredibly, incredibly powerful. So our key point number two, cities must begin to enact common sense ordinances that help them manage public spaces. So now I'm shifting here. We're talking about panhandling. We took just a quick journey down a panhandling study that was done that was meant to tell you that the people who are panhandling in your community, If the people panhandling the most are probably folks who are really homeless and probably have drug addiction issues, alcohol addiction issues, and also mental illness. By the way, on a side note, the opioid crisis raging around America, probably playing into driving what we're seeing on our streets as well. But the second point, when you're looking at panhandling, when mayor, law enforcement, business chambers, who we have some business chambers that join this, your job is to balance, to have a strategy on homelessness, panhandling, public spaces that balances and manages all this. And what we've done in America, it hasn't worked. I hate to say that because it pains my heart, because I love so many of the individuals that have worked on homelessness, and I think we've seen some results. But when I say it hasn't worked, what I mean is, if you look at your city, if you look at cities around America, we have invested billions of dollars, but it doesn't feel like we've even made a dent. It feels like homelessness, panhandling, all of this has gotten worse, not better. So that's the premise that I'm bringing all of this to you. So the second point is, cities must begin to enact common sense ordinances. If you're watching this by yourself, write down common sense on a piece of paper. If you're with your team, look at the person next to you and say, have some common sense, because you have got to manage your public spaces. If you do not manage your public spaces are going to wind up, no matter how, let me say it this way, Mayor, no matter how much money you spend on homelessness. This is really the story of a lot of the cities that I showed you earlier, not to pick on them, but this is just from the bottom of my heart. Mayor, if people are telling you that you can invest tons of money into services for those who are homeless, which you need to do. You need shelters. You need housing for people who have disabilities. You need a lot of things. You need investments on homelessness. But if people are telling you that by itself is going to solve your problem, I'm here to tell you I don't believe that's true. You have to couple that with public space management and ordinances with law enforcement that are going to work. So let me talk to you a little bit about that. Public space management, as you guys look at it through your city lens, is about, economic development, cultural development, and tourism, and transportation. All of that comes into public space management. I actually think now cities need to have a wing of public space management that's really homelessness, because that's part of, unfortunately, what you're dealing with every single day. So I've got a couple slides here I want to show you that are not my slides. They're actually slides from a national conference on homelessness that happened recently. I left these individuals, this organization's name on the slides because I wanted to kind of give them credit. This is on the internet. So, but this organization, I think it's called the National Alliance, the National Center for Justice. I think that's their name. Tent City USA, that's their hashtag. They put out some slides, and I want to just give you a contrasting view. I don't want to disrespect these people, but I will tell you I disagree with their premise, and I want to tell you where I disagree with them. So they have a very accurate chart here. We're going to send you all this data, but they have an accurate chart showing that encampments have absolutely skyrocketed in America over the last, really 10 years. And there's not even a trend line for 18 and 19. But encampments are popping up everywhere. So if you're seeing them in your community, this is what we're seeing in America. You know what's interesting, just a little interesting side note. The investment of money into homelessness has not skyrocketed at this level, but there has been some pretty significant investments of money on homelessness, especially with veterans. The initiative to really fund veterans homelessness from 2008 to 2012, that's when we saw a 4 or 5-fold increase in the federal budget for veterans homeless programs. So we didn't see that same increase for general programs for homelessness, but we didn't cut money. If anything, we added money to administrations, bipartisan administration, both through the Obama administration and then the early part of now President Trump's administration. But we're seeing encampments everywhere. But this was a slide, and this is their presentation. I'll let them speak for themselves. where they talked about legal considerations, and what they were really pushing is that communities need to embrace encampments. They need to embrace encampments and really look at integrating encampments into the community, and that if you break encampments down, if you use law enforcement to move encampments out, that this is their quote, it should be the Eighth Amendment basically is violated if you put ordinances in place that are anti-camping, and this is they're quoting a U.S. Department of Justice versus a case called Beal versus Boise. I just want you to know, I put this slide up here because there's a great legal battle, and people in your world, Mayor, might tell you that this is you're just going to have to allow panhandling in all forms. You're going to have to allow people laying on the ground. You're going to have to allow encampments, because if you don't, you're violating the Eighth Amendment. Let me just give you an alternative view, because I think it's important. And we're going to send all this to you. I'm going to go through it very quickly, but these are the federal cases on charitable solicitation that you need to know. I'm just going to rush through this and then make my bigger point here, Mayor. Law enforcement, check this out as well. So if you look at the 1980 case, Schomburg versus Citizens for a Better Environment, not going into this case in great detail, but basically a ruling came out that the Supreme Court ruled that this village urges that 75% requirements, there was a percentage requirement that really dictated the legality of what would be inside of a panhandling discussion. And for more than 30 years, that ruling allowed the conditions on panhandling that you saw and that you existed under. Now, by the way, you might have ordinances that don't allow any panhandling or allow all panhandling. I'm just telling you, if those were challenged in court, these are the case laws that dictate whether or not those would hold up. So something really big, that was 30 years, but something really big happened in 2015. Don't worry, we're going to send all this to you, mayors, law enforcement. We're going to send this to you. Some of you, we've already scheduled calls to go through it. Don't worry about what's here. Worry about more the bigger points here. Reed versus Town of Gilbert, Arizona was a huge, huge court case that really redefined panhandling, encampments, homelessness in America. And it was actually a church. It wasn't even about homelessness. Pastor Reed had no church for church home, and so they were putting out signs all over their community, putting signs up, taking them down, putting them up, taking them down, advertising their church. And so what happened is they had 23 different signs, and the town of Gilbert, Arizona said, you can't do this. We're going to put restrictions on your right to put these signs up. And what happened is the pastor sued them, and long story short, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said this: the justices determined that the regulation of speech is content-based if the law applies to a particular speech because of the topic discussed or the idea or message expressed. Here's the common sense version of this. What the justices said is that you cannot, it's a violation of the First Amendment for you to try to regulate communication of any sort. So they have this ruling, and then what happens is 11 days later, they start applying this case in other places. Thayer versus Worcester. In 2013, the city of Worcester, Massachusetts passed 2 ordinances making it unlawful to panhandle. And that stood up for a few years. But after Reed, suddenly it came under legal scrutiny, and that court case was reversed. Again, I'm rushing through this, mayors, sheriffs, law enforcement, and others, rushing through because I want to be able to answer your questions. But you see how Thayer then, because of Reed, was reversed. And in 2013, although they were able to put these ordinances in place, that case came back and then was overturned. So basically, what's happened since 2015 is speech regulation targeted at specific subject matter is content-based, even if it does not discriminate among the viewpoints within that matter. So that's a mouthful, right? Here's what it really means to you, mayor, law enforcement, others watching this. In the most common sense way that I can put this out here, and I'll give you one example of what I'm about to tell you. in the most common sense way I can communicate this, if you try to pass ordinances banning panhandling, hey, and by panhandling, let me be specific here. Someone's walking down the street and they say, hey, can I have $1, Mayor? That's panhandling. The law, the Supreme Court said in these changes in their rulings that that's not panhandling. That's communication, and that communication is protected under the First Amendment. So whether it's a sign that says, please give me $1, or whether it's someone asking for money, panhandling is a form of communication, and it is, if you put ordinances in place banning it, those ordinances, at the point someone challenges them, you will lose in court, and you will lose every time. Don't turn the webinar off, because if you leave right there, you're going to miss some very important information. Because although panhandling is legal, and the courts have upheld that it's legal, the courts have not upheld that it's legal to lie on the ground in public spaces. The courts have not created precedent that says putting encampments up are legal. So this is where it gets interesting. Panhandling protected, and the courts have come down pretty strong on that. But the courts have not in every situation said that encampments or sleeping in public spaces or lying in public spaces is protected. So let's look at an example of that. In 2016, homeless helping homeless. Now cities are grappling with this. Tampa, if you're on the webinar, forgive me for using your example, but it's a very pertinent example. City of Tampa puts an ordinance in place, Ordinance 2013-95, Section 1445B. It shall be unlawful for a person to solicit donations. They're now going to put out something in specific areas that's in a direct contradiction to the cases you saw just a second ago. And I'll tell you what happened is the ACLU came in and sued them, and Tampa lost in court and lost very, very badly, and wound up having to undo and create ordinances that really opened panhandling up and all aspects of this issue up in a way that was very much not of their choosing. So Orlando, Florida, I think is a good example of the opposite direction. Orlando, Florida, which is my hometown, actually went the other direction, seeing Tampa and these other cities and looking at the Reed case and others. Orlando had a very prohibitive panhandling ordinance. It actually reversed that and took its focus away from panhandling by itself and put its focus on aggressive panhandling, which is someone who's a captive audience using an ATM, or panhandling in intersections, or camping, encampments, laying on the ground, etc. So mayor, law enforcement, stay with me a second. This is my big point to you. My big point to you is you've got to create a more complicated set of ordinances that aren't going to be as simple as all panhandling is illegal. If you panhandle, you go to jail. If you do that, at some point, you're going to lose, and lose badly in court. That's every city that has put those ordinances in place since 2015 has lost, and lost badly. You're seeing it around America. That being the case, though, if you don't put together ordinances like I'm seeing happen, and we're coaching cities around America that restrict aggressive panhandling, and that do not allow sit and lie, and the worst thing you can do, my opinion, I'm entitled to it, Mayor, the worst thing you can do, and law enforcement, the worst thing you can do is allow people to live and put up temporary long-term tents or any kind of dwellings in public space. The absolute worst thing you can do. Because by the way, we have a lot more we can tell you about offline on this. Every time you do that, you're actually creating a precedent. We've done work in California, a certain community, Anaheim, California. You can Google this. I don't have a slide for it. You can Google it. But Anaheim, California, they had a 600-person homeless encampment in front of the Anaheim Angels Stadium. Go into Google and put Anaheim homeless encampment right now. You'll see all these articles pop up. Long story short, they allowed this encampment for multiple months, multiple years. and then disease and death, and it became encampments. By the way, I want to say this because I think it's important. I'm not against encampments because I'm trying to persecute folks who are homeless. I'm telling you, encampments are bad for folks who are homeless. They're inhumane. They're bad for business. They're filled with disease and sex predators and drugs. Encampments aren't good for anybody. So this whole idea that encampments should be part of the homeless solution, I disagree with it 100%. Now, at the same time, we're going to have to find alternatives: shelter, housing, other solutions. If encampments aren't the answer. But I would tell you, Anaheim, California, they had ordinances saying that encampments were not legal, but they weren't enforcing those ordinances. And so once a certain amount of time had passed and they didn't enforce their ordinances, and then they tried to enforce them, a federal judge came in, blocked them from enforcing their anti-camping ordinances, and it wound up in a year-long court battle and cost that community so much money. And in the end, they had to spend money defending the court case and ultimately helping these people get other help. So if you don't have the right ordinances in place, you're going to be in big trouble. If you have ordinances in place and you don't enforce them, you could wind up undoing all the good that those ordinances could put in place. So kind of skipping ahead, I'll send you guys all this. You need to have ordinances on aggressive panhandling, sit and lie, disorderly conduct, and anti-camping ordinances. Those are the four. Those are the four we want to recommend to you, and we can give you more information on the specifics of how to put those in place. And you need to work with law enforcement to enforce them and enforce them in a way that's humane. But at the same time is absolute. When it comes to panhandling, Mayor, I got bad news for you. Panhandling is constitutionally protected under the First Amendment of the United States. And if you set rigid ordinances in place banning panhandling, not only will you undermine your other ordinances, but ultimately you will lose in court and create a worse situation for yourself. So that's kind of the overarching, and I've got some other court cases I'll show you later. Here's another, when it comes to the legalities of panhandling and encampments, let me give you some other tips here. What can cities do? You got to ensure that low-income housing, supportive housing is increased. And when I'm showing you this, I'm actually taking this from a legal standpoint. If you are going to move people out of encampments, the courts are going to make sure that there's a reasonable alternative that your community is offering these folks. So whether it's low-income supportive housing, shelter spaces, and you have to be able to show then that camping at some level is a choice for that person because shelter or something else is available. So Mayor, don't let me be the bearer of bad news. Law enforcement, don't let me be the bearer of bad news. But if you decide to put in place the right ordinances, anti-camping, anti-sit and lie, and you don't have any shelter, and you're not investing in any way in giving people an alternative, if the ACLU or someone smart takes you to court, you'll still lose because you didn't show that camping is a choice. Now, I'm not saying it's a choice in more than the legal aspect is a choice. So that was a whole lot to take in, but we started with the idea that you got to understand who panhandlers are. A lot of times the folks doing the panhandling in your community, they're not professional panhandlers. They're not people you're going to be able to arrest and run them out of town. They're going to be folks who are legitimately homeless, and usually the studies we've recently done are going to show a straight line between mental illness, drug addiction, and those who are chronically homeless and chronically panhandling. At the same time, I would tell you that you've got to be cognizant of the fact that while you're putting together strategies to get shelter in place and to do permanent supportive housing and all these things that you must do these things. And there's money to do these things. If you do that, but you don't have common sense ordinances that are built upon the new reality that has legally opened up panhandling, but not opened up these other aspects, sit and lie, aggressive panhandling, allowing encampments, tents to go up. If you allow tents to go up, you are going to undermine everything you're doing on homelessness. That is my opinion, and I know I've seen it in communities around America. So those are the first 2 points. The third point is that cities must be able to put in place modern strategies to find permanent solutions for those that are homeless. I want to talk for just a few minutes about that, but let me get to a couple other questions. We had a question, how will ongoing court cases affect a city's ability to manage chronic panhandling in encampments? This is Michael Smith, Deputy City Attorney from Tacoma. Listen, the courts are ruling on this on a constant basis. I would tell you, though, based on the Supreme Court, I'm just giving you my opinion. If you look at the makeup of the Supreme Court, I don't think this is going to go too far the other direction. I think the way the courts have ruled recently is going to be a good indication of how this issue is going to be framed in the future. I don't see a scenario where they're going to ban panhandling. I don't see it happening. But I also, you could see a scenario where it becomes much more stringent, the requirements of what you're required to do to give alternatives to people if you're removing encampments. That's why number 3 is very, very important. How do you deal with a growing homeless population? I think we'll talk about that in point number 3 here as well. And how do you provide shelter for people that don't want it? All of those will be addressed in point number 3 here, and that's that cities must find modern strategies for permanent solutions for those who are homeless. Orlando's my hometown. I'll use it as an example because I think Orlando's a great example. If you look in 2013, Orlando was ranked number 1 in America for like-sized cities for chronic homelessness, ranked in the top 4. Orlando is one of the 25 biggest media markets, cities in America, greater Central Florida. We ranked in the top 4 in every category of homelessness. It was a community that was really, really struggling with homelessness. But here's fascinating. Here's Orlando today, just a few years later. 94% reduction in veterans homelessness, a 54% total reduction in homelessness in Orlando, Florida. That's crazy, right? Can't be true. It's absolutely true. And how did they do that? I think they did it in a way that is very, very intelligent, and I want to share it with you for just a second. So, Mayor, you might be doing this, law enforcement, you might be doing this, but I just got to reiterate this to you because I don't want to mislead you today. This is a webinar on panhandling, and we absolutely are here to give you what I will candidly tell you is contradictory advice to many people out there who, in like that PowerPoint I showed you earlier, national groups who say, if you want to solve homelessness, allow people to camp. Put porta potties out there. Stop enforcing laws when it comes to people living in public spaces. I could not disagree with that more. And by the way, turn on your TV to some of these cities in America that this is their philosophy. These cities spend tens of millions, some of them hundreds of millions a year, and by the way, on good programs that ultimately are not coupled with ordinances and common sense public space management, and that's one of the reasons why they fail. So, Mayor, I want to go through a few things that you got to do, even if you're doing the right, if you have the right ordinances, you've got to focus on some of the things Orlando did. One of those things, permanent housing. I cannot stress enough that if you're looking at solving homelessness in an intelligent way, then what Lead Homelessness is going to tell you is you're not going to solve poverty. I'm sorry, you're not. There's no community in America that solved poverty-related homelessness. You got to have food banks. You want to have all these job programs. I'm a big proponent of those. I'm not against those. But if you're going to solve homelessness, I encourage you to look into focusing some of your efforts on chronic homelessness. Write down chronic homelessness. If you don't know what that is, some of you know it very well. We've talked to you about it. But if you're going to look at chronic homelessness, which is people with disabilities, then ultimately there's one solution to people who are disabled, have mental illness, physical disabilities, and that is permanent housing. And that's where you say someone who's homeless, We might have to have a shelter for them. We might have to have other options at times. But if you're ever going to get someone who's mentally ill off the streets, even the drug addiction that we talked about earlier, here's where that can be misleading. You're not going to be able to treat drug addiction if someone's homeless, living under a bridge. So those that are coming to you, Mayor, and saying, we've got to do more permanent supportive housing, I couldn't agree more. But it's got to be targeted at the right people. And maybe, this is what you might find, Mayor, law enforcement, you might find this. We believe there's an intersection between those who are panhandling most and a lot of your folks who are actually chronically homeless and need permanent supportive housing. And if that's the case, targeted initiatives where you're looking at people who are mentally ill and vulnerable and at the same time maybe panhandling because of addiction and trying to get them off the streets, that's something you could really look at and you should look at. This cycle again, the people that are in this chronic homeless cycle, Mayor, you've got to find solutions for them, and arresting them is not going to cut it, even though sometimes we do have to arrest people or move them to keep public space management going. So again, another aspect, Mayor, when it comes to how you manage homelessness and these modern practices, we encourage you to build a leadership team in your community that's not just, your providers and that sort of thing, to get business leaders and others involved to build accountability on this issue. We think it's incredibly important. And Mayor, remember this, that ultimately there's so many people in your community who are struggling with homelessness, and they're struggling for legitimate reasons. So you've got to have programs to help them, and compassionate programs. Some of you are putting questions in. I know we've covered a lot of ground. Let me come back to this question. How can you provide shelter for someone who doesn't want it? What's the best way to deal with panhandlers on street corners? So when it comes to someone not wanting help, remember that a lot of these folks are going to be people who, this is the big challenge you have. A lot of these folks who say they don't want help, because if they are mentally ill or they have a disabling condition, that makes that when is a choice not a choice. I think that's where we have to be very cognizant. Someone doesn't want help, we're probably going to have to be, there might not be an easy answer to that. But we don't want to not be nuanced in the way we think about someone who might have bipolar schizophrenia. They might have a severe anxiety disorder. They might not be of a capacity to get help. And so I've seen many communities, Miami, Florida is a great example of this, and Houston, Texas has done this well. They'll create outreach teams that have incredibly skilled, clinical level caseworkers that are going to go out and outreach to someone, but outreach to them from a mental health professional standpoint. So I just would be cautious about people who don't want help using that as a blanket statement. That being said, you cannot allow that person to put up a tent in your community. You cannot allow encampments and tents in your community for whatever reason. So Mayor, law enforcement, others, you're seeing this what almost feels like a contradiction from us, but it's not. What we're telling you is you gotta have programs that help get people off the streets, but at the same time, you cannot allow people to live in public spaces, which probably means you're gonna have to invest more money into shelters if you're not doing it, and permanent housing as a solution for people who ultimately are in this cycle. Permanent housing is going to be something you're going to have to target properly. I want to go back because we had a question about some of our what cities can do when it comes to ordinances. I think what you guys should consider doing is putting together a group of leaders. You need to get law enforcement, you need to get your city and your county, and maybe a few of your high-impact business leaders in your community. Put together a committee, and we'd love to help you with this, and look at all of the ordinances that you currently have. I got a question in here. And judge your ordinances based on the case law that I put up earlier. I think that's a great next step for some of you working on this issue right now. We got a question from Andrew Wolcott. In regards to panhandling, it's our impression you can still cite arrest people that are violating other laws in the process of panhandling. For example, a person walking in the road illegally intoxicated can be cited. Is that your understanding? So, Andrew, great question, and 100%. So, getting kind of technical here, if someone approaches you on the street and says, "Hey, can I have $1?" That is, they don't touch you, they don't threaten you. That's constitutionally protected. By the way, they can just keep asking you, "Hey, can I have $1?" They can actually, you can walk down the street and they can kind of just follow you a little bit and say, "Hey, can I have $1?" That's constitutionally protected. By the way, your community's probably got people that are for Trump, anti-Trump. Those people follow each other around with protected communication as well. So think of it in that light. So panhandling, legal in that particular situation. But, Andrew, if that person contains you in an area, you sit down at a restaurant outside, you're at an ATM, and that person kind of has you cornered, and you're a captive audience. That's the term. So that's illegal. You cannot do that, and that person can be cited or arrested. Another thing is someone has a sign, "Hey, I need $1, please help me." That's constitutionally protected underneath the First Amendment of the United States. If they follow you around a little bit with that sign, that's going to be protected. That's what the Reed case showed us. But if they lay on the ground and hold that sign up, that is not constitutionally protected. That could be sit and lie. That could be disorderly conduct. If that person walks into an intersection, there's a lot of leeway in the courts right now on busy intersections that it's dangerous for you to be panhandling or doing any kind of solicitation in busy intersections. So you absolutely, that's disorderly conduct. If you are at a busy intersection, you're taking or receiving something from a car. Some people get killed that way. That's very dangerous. So absolutely, Andrew, the devil's in the details here, and this is where your city, your mayor, your law enforcement needs to come together and have an educated kind of twofold look at this. What are our ordinances in each of the categories I've laid out? How do they compare to the legalities that we're seeing happening around America? But then, Andrew, you got to ask yourself, are we legitimately putting resources into shelter, into some permanent housing for people with chronic homelessness and disabilities? Because if you're not, and you create these common sense ordinances, you're still going to lose in court if you have not showed that you've given alternatives. And by the way, you should give alternatives. If you're not helping people who are chronically homeless with disabilities, you should. That's the right thing. This is not, I don't want to give you any impression that I don't believe that. And this is why I love cities like Orlando, Houston, Miami, Salt Lake City, others. I think a lot of them have combined both common sense ordinances with compassion and investing in housing first and other things as well. So, Andrew, I hope that answers your question. If not, we can answer it more offline. Carol Bronson, please talk about the sitting ordinances. We want people to sit in our public spaces. So, again, this is nuanced, Carol, and but you have to be able to, in an ordinance, be able to differentiate between sitting in public spaces and laying in public spaces and living in public spaces. So this is where your smart lawyers, you all pay really nice lawyers that work for your city, can help you. We can help you sort that out. But there has to be a distinction between someone sitting in public spaces, sitting in a wheelchair in public spaces, all kinds of sitting for the purpose that is defined inside of your public space management, versus sit and lie, which is really someone laying in public spaces in the same way they would lay in a dwelling. They're living in those public spaces. And Carol, the nature of your question is fantastic, because what you're saying is, this is complicated, and I'm absolutely agreeing with you. Think about a public park. Think about your local park. it's a picnic on Saturday, and you want to be able to, go with your husband or your wife or your boyfriend or your girlfriend and have a picnic and lay on the grass and look at the sun. That's what public spaces are for. And so you got to have common sense ordinances that understand that. But at the same time, you got to be able to differentiate between that and someone using public spaces as where they're sleeping and living. And so, again, Carol, you got to protect public spaces, but you're going to have to get more nuanced to do that. I want to also recap to some of you were asking this. If you want to, we're we care. At Lead Homelessness, we absolutely care. We talk to mayors, law enforcement, chambers of commerce, COCs, others about this every single day. To us, the great tragedy of homelessness right now is the amount of people suffering on the streets with all these billions of dollars being invested, and us feeling as a society that we have no solution. So, this is where our heart is, and we want you to be able to submit questions or email us. Some of you out there, all we've done with this webinar is frustrate you because we gave you a bunch of information and you need way more information. Listen, we understand that. You can email us at Lead Homelessness. We'd love to set up a phone call with you. Some of you, we're already working with you right now to help you create new ordinances, create new strategies for homelessness. Our partners out there want to say thank you, and thank you for joining this webinar. But feel free to contact us and get more information. Next steps, Madison, who's on our team, who's in this room, who you might have heard from, she's going to be reaching out to you to set up a call. Some of you have already set up calls. We're excited to talk to you and learn more about ways we want to help you. Listen, if you're out there and you need help, we want to absolutely help you. We're also going to be sending you resources. We're going to be putting together some new resources after the panhandling study comes out. I teased this panhandling study to you. I'm sorry I couldn't give you all of it. It's not released publicly to the middle of November, but I will tell you the panhandling study I think is going to be profound to help you make decisions on all of this, because as mayor, as a sheriff, as someone who works for a mayor, this is something that you're dealing with every day, and it's not going to go away, but you're going to, again, have to balance compassion and common sense. If someone is telling you that you can arrest your way out of this panhandling problem, if someone's telling you that arresting people and taking down encampments is the solution by itself, that's wrong. I don't agree with that. But what we've seen, Mayor, what we've seen in America is this incredible investment in permanent supportive housing and these coordinated systems around America, but we haven't coupled that with common sense public space management, and it's failed. It's failed, and we're looking for solutions. I believe there's so much of that work that needs to be preserved. Permanent supportive housing needs to be expanded in this country at a great level for those with disabilities. But we need to also preserve public spaces, or we're going to undercut the public's belief in this issue. Kind of a final question I'll take here. Stephen, examples of existing ordinances in Massachusetts that enforce panhandlers and homelessness successfully. So we would have to pull those up, but I would tell you, I don't care what state you're in, Stephen, this is really the most important thing I would say to your question. No matter what state you're in, federal law is going to supersede anything on the state level. So when you look at the Reed case, when you look at Thayer versus Worcester, like these are cases, and you got to keep your eye on the ball because there's new cases coming down the pike. But ultimately, I would tell you, we'll reach out to you offline, talk to you a little bit about this. But ultimately, summarizing it for you, your mayor, your law enforcement, panhandling. If you try to create ordinances to ban panhandling, you're going to lose in court, and you're going to ultimately unwind some of the good work you're trying to do in your community if you do that. I do not recommend you pass panhandling ordinances that overreach. But with that being the case, you must put together common sense ordinances, in my opinion, that do not allow aggressive panhandling, Do not allow people to sit and lie in public spaces in egregious ways. And more than anything, you should not be allowing, I know this is contrary to some of what you're being told, do not allow tents and encampments in your community, especially in public spaces. They are inhumane, and they do not add value to someone who's homeless, and they ultimately do not add value to your community, and they're dangerous, and they change the laws. No matter if you have the right ordinances or not, you allow encampments, and then the law, the precedent of you allowing that encampment supersedes the ordinances you have in place. So again, thank you so much for joining this webinar. A lot we threw at you. We'll be in touch with you. Thank you for the work you're doing as a mayor in cities around America, law enforcement, others, and keep going down the road of helping more people in need and making your community a better place. Thank you so much. We'll be talking to you soon.